Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session Improving ROI with Implementation of DevSecOps by Udit Saxena. And I am Ritika Chakraborty. I will be your host for the day. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen only mode and will last for an hour, and out of which last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. If you have any questions during the webinar to the organizer or the panelists, please post your query in the Q&A window. Also, if you face any audio video challenges, please check your internet connection or you may log out and log in again. And very important announcement for the certificate of attendance. Participants need to attend the complete webinar to qualify for the certificate of attendance. Participants should fill in the survey form in the attendees thank you email and answer the 3 questions based on the webinar provided with the right answers. If these 2 criteria are met, then only the participant will receive the certificate of attendance within 5 to 7 working days after the webinar. Now, about our speaker. Udit is an information security leader and advisor with more than 13 years of experience in application security, infrastructure security, security engineering, 24/7 security operations, threat hunting, and cloud security. He currently works as a consulting leader and trusted advisor for client CXOs regarding all aspects of cyber risk management, strategy, planning, transformation, cyber threat management, and cyber operations. So, now without any further delay, I would hand over the session to you, Udit.
Thank you, Ritika, for my introduction. Hello, everyone. Look forward to having a fruitful session. If you have questions, you can always put it in the chat and then we'll take it at the end of the session. So I'll start by talking about why the title of this session is about improving ROI with implementation of DevSecOps. So in security, or let's take an example of, before we go jump into cybersecurity or information security, let's take an example of development right. So if you are building something for an organization, you always have these business cases that you build together, and those business cases are built on an idea that either you'll improve the customer acquisition, or you'll bring in more revenue when you are building that system, or you'll optimize the overall efficiency of that system, whereby you are going to reduce the costs involved in running that system. Now, so similarly, when we talk about cybersecurity, anything that we do in cybersecurity, any new ideas that come about, or any security departments that you're building, should start with a question on what is the return on investment when you are going to do all of this work, right? So the idea behind this session is to help you build a business case of DevSecOps, right? So identify what are the key drivers of DevSecOps, what DevSecOps is, how it improves your ability to deal with threats, thereby ensuring return on investment. Now, in case of cybersecurity, the return on investment is not about how much optimization can you do in a system or in a product. It's all about how you are able to deal with external threats or internal threats that might exist in your environment. So we are going to focus on how can we improve your return on investment on cybersecurity with DevSecOps. So let's jump on and let's start with the agenda first. So I've kept these slides very simple. These have been sourced from 3 key sources. First one is CrowdStrike blogs. The second one is IBM data breach report, which they come every year about how much costs are incurred in breaches. And then the last one is DevSecOps.org, which does a little bit of good job in actually defining what is the extended mindset about DevSecOps. So these are the 3 sources. We are going to keep it very simple. There are only going to be 4 slides. We'll start with what DevSecOps is, how it is an improvement or is an attempt of cybersecurity teams to actually be part of the DevOps realm. Then we'll come and talk about security integrated CI/CD pipelines. We'll move on and we will talk about DevSecOps mindset. So this is an extension of all the nitty-gritty and technical aspects of DevSecOps and what the mindset is about. And then we'll conclude it with talking about the ensuring ROI of the investment that you might do in DevSecOps. So let's start with the first one, which is what is uh, DevSecOps, right? So DevSecOps originates from DevOps, and the idea of DevOps is to make sure that prior to DevOps, you had these software departments which used to have different teams. So you had a software development team, you had an operations team, you had the QA team, and all of these teams were assigned specific jobs, right? So development team is supposed to build a product, deploy the product in a dev environment, then make sure that they do work on it. Once it's up and running, it's good enough, it's sufficiently well built, you move it to a staging environment, and then from staging you promote it to an operations environment. So all these departments were assigned different duties. So your software development teams and QA teams usually used to work starting from your dev environment to staging environment, and then in production environment operations teams used to take over. Now, one of the key challenge was that, let's say if you are facing an issue in production environment, who's going to deal with that issue? That's always going to be your operations teams, right? So you might have NOC team, which will have an application support team. So I'm just taking these names so that you might relate to it. But the idea is that all these teams were responsible for facing the issues which come on those applications or systems which are built by your development teams. Now, what used to happen is, let's say as part of your operations, you find an issue where you identify there is some severe deficiency in the applications that's built by your dev team. You will basically be reaching out to them, and which used to be a different department altogether. So then it will cause further friction on whose responsibility it is, because let's say if it happens as part of the deployment itself, and at that time, because the dev team is involved in that deployment, they'll take the responsibility easily because they were working on a feature which is going live, that feature doesn't work, or there's some deficiency in security, there's some deficiency in the performance. All those things, they'll be responsible for it because they did it as part of the deployment. But let's say if the issue happens which is related to prior deployments, let's say a change which was introduced 6 months back, in those cases the responsibility and ownership used to be very tricky because nobody wants to take an ownership of it because it's already deployed, signed off by the operations teams, everything was working well, but now you identify some deficiency which exists in something that was created long time ago. Now, in those cases, what used to happen was that they will reach out to the dev team again, then dev team will take it through the change management process, go through the iterations of how to develop it and take care of those issues. So that's where the DevOps came in. DevOps tried to break those boundaries between the software development and operations team so that the entire teams works together throughout the application development lifecycle. If there is an issue in production, the DevOps team will take over and make sure that they fix it and deploy the hot fix as fast as possible and ensure that there's no monetary harm to the organization. So this was DevOps, and it was aimed at breaking these silos, right? And as cybersecurity teams saw the opportunity, they identified that in this process, there's a possibility that as part of the fixes or the changes that these teams are making, the DevOps teams are making, they might actually introduce a lot of security vulnerabilities as well. So let's say if the security team stays out of your DevOps practices, all the changes will still be reviewed by your security team, and this process will remain older, right? So you will have a security team where the change will go and the security team will do whatever types of reviews they intend to do, and then they'll say, okay, you are good to go ahead and deploy the change in production. Rather than doing this siloed approach, the approach in DevSecOps is to bring security team as well and be part of the team itself, part of the gang, right? And it allows security integration to be part of every step of the process, which means that when someone is trying to fix an issue in production, they're part of it. They are discussing with the other member of DevOps teams. They're making sure that the security integration is taken seriously, and they'll basically be doing all the activities required to ensure there are no security issues introduced in production environment. Now, this is interesting, but it's easier said than done, because when you talk about implementing security, there are a lot of different processes. Just to highlight a few of them, let's say you want to do a design review, you want to do a code review, you want to do a DAS dynamic scan, right? Or you want to do a third-party library scan. All of those things need to happen before the product can be deployed. So that's why when we talk about DevSecOps, there's also a mindset change required in your security teams, which is going to be about making sure that whatever you can automate are all automated processes. You need to automate everything that's possible. You need to make sure that if you need to add additional steps in your pipeline, all those should be automated and should take as minimal time as possible. And it enables the continuous integration of these processes as part of your software development, CI/CD pipelines and DevOps processes. And what happens with that is that as everyone becomes responsible for security, this is what we always wanted as cybersecurity teams, that we wanted to make sure that our developers are becoming more aware of security. And when they are developing code, they should know that they should not introduce, silly mistakes in the code, like not doing an input validation on a data supplied by end user, things like that. So this allows us to make sure that we continuously, as we are doing all these activities on an ongoing basis, more and more employees and teams become responsible for the work that they are doing, and they share more responsibility for improving security of the organization. So with that, I'm going to take one more view of this entire thing on what DevSecOps is. So let's say if you used to be a company, an organization where you had implemented security as part of your secure development lifecycle, right? What you would, in those cases, there were at least 3 or 4 key processes that needs to happen. So the first one will be when you are designing a system, you want to do a security design review, right? That design review sometimes also included a threat modeling activity, right? Which is also a design activity which will be done by you. Then the second phase will be when the developer is writing code, you'll want that to make sure that the code doesn't have vulnerabilities in it. So you'll be basically doing a SAST scan, which is static application security testing. So you'll be basically scanning the code and making sure that there are no vulnerabilities in that code. Then you move on, and when the application is deployed in an environment up and running, you also want to do DAST, which is dynamic application security testing. And at the end is when the environment is built where the code is supposed to be deployed. You also want to make sure that there are no configuration issues in that environment. Let's say you're deploying on an Apache server or an Nginx server, or in a cloud environment or on-premises environment. You want to make sure there are no vulnerabilities in the environment itself. So you'll be ideally doing sort of a cyber attack surface assessment or environment hardening of that assessment, making sure that there are no vulnerabilities in that environment and things like that. So these are 3-4 processes which used to happen. And in then standardized a traditional approach, you would do these things as these will be basically, you'll have a small security team working with a large development team, and they'll be raising tickets, assigning it to you at a task. So every time they want to build, they are going through, let's say, a design of a system, they'll assign a threat modeling ticket to you. Someone from your team will pick up and perform that activity. And similarly, they'll assign tickets for SaaS, they'll assign ticket for DAS, they'll assign ticket for environment reviews, and you'll be doing those activities as the software development moves along. Now, because you're not integrated as part of the process, there'll be a lot of back and forth communication in this. So let's say you do a review. First of all, your time is important, so you'll have to prioritize which one is important, which one is not, which ticket goes first, which ticket goes later, and this all of those things increase friction. So one more example of that friction will be, let's say you find a SQL injection issue. in a code which requires a lot of development changes in someone who is building up a solution right now. So the dev team will have resistance saying that, let's say this vulnerability is not as critical as you claim it to be, because we might have additional controls in place, or this application is hosted inside the environment, so it doesn't have any external attacker and things like that. So all those things used to increase a lot of friction between them, and security teams used to be sort of feared and also not liked by anyone. So my advice is that if you implement and change your mindset and use DevSecOps in a right manner, it can actually improve the reputation of security teams in the organization as well. So that said, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to talk about what are the key activities as part of DevSecOps. So I've already touched upon some of these things, but just to touch upon the terminologies, right? So if you are a security engineer, or if you are an application security guy, you will always know those terms like which I talked about: threat modeling, SaaS, DAST, third-party code scanning, SCA as it is called, or environment hardening, cyber attack surface assessment, and all of those things. But if you want to talk about in DevOps terminology, there are 5 types of checks which happen. The first one is pre-commit check. The second one is commit time check. Third one is build time check, test time check, and deploy time check. So these are basically created because when you are actually creating the CI/CD pipeline of any product, you will create these checks or these sections separately from each other, and it acts like a manufacturing supply chain, right? So you have one thing, and if you pass first thing, so you go to the second one, then you go to the second, third one, and things like that. So the first one is pre-commit check. So developers, whenever they are building code, they will basically want to check their source code into a source code repository, right? So as soon as they do something like that, it can be a trigger which will call out that you will receive an email notification which will say perform a threat modeling on it. Then the commit time check can be gathering metrics, automate some security testing on it. Build time checks can be risk-based security testing and stuff like that. Test time checks can be which are after your successful full build, you want to detect if there are any malicious code in it and things like that. So basically all the activities that we were talking about, threat modeling, SaaS, DAST, SCA, will fall into these areas depending on the type of pipeline that you build. Also, this will also be based on different organizations. So what I mean by that is that these 5 phases are sort of standard DevOps phases that we have, right? But organizations might name these sections differently depending on the DevOps guidelines and DevOps principles that they follow. But the principles of security remain same. You have to make sure that you do the design reviews. You have to make sure that you are scanning the code. You have to make sure there are certain additional things which are also part of DevSecOps. For example, there is secret scanning, which is also performed as part of your code scanning nowadays, which has separate types of tools. So for example, you have Git secrets, truffle hog in open source, and things like that, which allow you to check whether there is any secrets configured as part of the code somewhere, and so that you avoid leaking secrets via those channels. So all of those checks that we are talking about will fall in one of these 5 sections, and the idea will be that you will automate all those checks as part of the pipeline, and you'll make sure that you trigger those and you automate as much as possible. So as much as possible is important here because there is one activity which I think requires additional manual effort from our side, which is threat modeling, and it's in the pre-commit check if you see, right? The reason for putting it by one of my idea that this is where the actual inputs have to be provided by the security expert, whoever is part of the DevSecOps team, to make sure that he's looking at the issues holistically, and some of the issues which cannot be identified, let's say by tools, have to be caught in at the design level. So design flaws have to be identified using threat modeling, and these are the activity which are sort of manual in nature. You'll have to understand what the requirements are, what type of applications you are building. You can use different types of threat modeling methodologies like stride or pasta and stuff like that. The idea will be that you want to make sure that the design level issues are not left alone, and you catch them as well when you are doing these activities. Other than that, I think most of the activities can be automated, and you'll have to make sure that you are doing those things. So for example, the last one, which is deployment time checks, right? So at the deployment time, especially when you have DevOps pipelines in place, you'll have to see what type of deployment you are talking about, right? So let's say you are building something on AWS cloud. In that case, AWS has first of all different types of configuration. So you'll have to see what type of configuration flaws exist and whether all those things are taken care of. On top of configuration issues, you also have to harden the environment, and then hardening and misconfiguration are slightly different terms. So I would like to explain it here, which is that when you talk about fixing a issue in terms of vulnerability, it can be that, let's say you are using an environment which has an open SSH port to public, right? Now that issue can be considered a misconfiguration because it will allow external attackers to try brute force attack against your SSH services, right? But what comes after it is even further complicated, which is how do you harden the environment, right? So hardening is about making sure that your attack surface is as minimal as possible. So in the previous example, when we talk about SSH port, there are two types of issues which can happen. Let's say you have an open SSH port for internet, right? So the first thing which can happen is so people can launch brute force attack against your SSH port, right? Which is simple to understand. And then you can say, okay, I want to keep it open and I'll put a control in front of it. If someone is trying brute force attack, will block his access from the network. Simple, right? So you have a control in place and you should think that it is okay. Now, the next thing is, what about knowing about SSH server, that's a service exists, and let's say a version of it. And if that version contains a vulnerability, then your entire environment becomes vulnerable, because if someone is able to exploit it and gain access to that SSH machine or the system that you are running where you are hosting SSH server, that server will be compromised and it will open the entire environment for compromise from attackers. So from security's point of view, we have to take care of both things. One is the taking care of environment's vulnerability. We need to make sure that nothing is vulnerable, and also reduce the attack surface so that there are minimum amount of services available for external attackers to try and exploit them. So when we are talking about, let's say, SSH in this section, first one was configuration related, that don't keep your SSH open to public. So it's a configuration hardening issues. But the second, where the vulnerable software exists, can be the vulnerability issues. So the deployment time checks should focus on both of those. Checking for vulnerability is one, which is you can use any vulnerability scanner, which is for let's say for in different environments. So it can be your, let's say, Qualys VMDR, Nessus, Nexpose, or any of that. And then on top of that, you should also use hardening components of the same tool, using, let's say, something like a CIS benchmarks, which will ensure that your attack surface is as minimal as possible with limited services open to internet. So with that said, I think I've covered most of the checks that you should make sure that those are part of your CI/CD pipeline. And we'll be moving on, and we'll be sort of expanding the idea of DevSecOps into a full-blown environment of how can you actually utilize DevSecOps in its entirety and make sure that you get really good outcomes out of it. So for that, I think although these are the principles that I've taken from devsecops.org, these are also general principles which apply on improving your security organization's acceptance inside the organization. So these are some of the principles that are very good, and if we can make them principles for our security teams, it will improve a lot of reputation that we have, the discussions that we have with other teams, and it will also improve a lot of return on investment that we get out of cybersecurity investments. So the first principle is leaning in. So cyber security guys have this reputation of saying no to everything. So If you want to deploy something in the environment, they'll say no. If you want to open a port from, let's say, staging environment to your test environment, they'll say no, and things like that. So there are different reasons why they are like that, because they believe in policies, procedure. They want to make sure that all the things are kept in consideration, especially when it comes to making sure that the risks to the environment are minimal. Now, this is very interesting for us, right? So how do we change our attitude from, always saying no to leaning in? So first thing that I think which can improve it is to understand the requirements from our teams that are coming and talking to us in its entirety, and making sure that we give them an ear, right? So for example, let's say if someone comes to you and says that I'm building a software which is going to need access to the database, which is deployed in a different VLAN, and I want access to my access from web server to the database, right? It's a simple request that they have, right? So you should give them a year, understand what the requirement is, what type of business goals someone is trying to achieve. And one more important associated principle that we should always keep in mind is that we are always security advisors to the organization where we are working in, right? So we are not necessarily the final arbiter for taking any decision. So let's say if there is risk involved in the activities that we think exist, we should take a simple approach and make sure that we communicate with the same risk to relevant stakeholder, explain to them, okay, these are the risks involved if you go ahead with this particular requirement. This is what might happen, and then take a risk-based approach of allowing acceptance for that, right? Now, in some cases that might be a huge risk also, because we want to be careful about what we do in the environment. So what I would suggest is be a little more thoughtful about what other teams are saying, and let's start from there. And as your communication with other teams improve, they will also try to listen to you, and the risk communication will improve a lot in the organization. So this principle is very important, improves a lot of back and forth and bad reputation we might have in the organization. The next one comes data and security science over fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Now, the whole idea about this webinar is obviously return on investment, right? So we need to make sure that when we are communicating to our peers in the organization, or the organization as a whole, we shouldn't use fear to drive security. Although it's unfortunately this is true. So you will see that if people see ransomware is exploiting a lot of organization, they'll immediately want to fix issues or try to find an answer to ransomware because they have a fear of it. So it can't be completely we can't completely get over it. So fear is always there. But for the DevSecOps principles, we need to make sure that as security organization, part of the larger organization, we do not use it as a leverage to actually get investment for us, or we don't necessarily want to do that, because it's going to create unnecessary uncertainties for the organization, and also create doubts in people's mind about what we are trying to achieve and implement. So the best answer to this is to actually deploy data science, or data science, which means that you have to identify what are the key performance indicators for different security functions. Let's say your DevSecOps has multiple different things happening, your threat modeling, your code reviews, your vulnerability scanning, right? So for all those, you should come up with key performance indicator and see how well you are doing, how bad you are doing, how can it relate to the overall risk the organization might have. So use a lot of risk scorecard approach towards it, and make sure that when you're communicating with within your organization, you're using those important aspects as your driver for communication, because that makes a lot of sense if you build your case on data, and it also allows room for discussions, negotiations, and things like that. Then the next one is open contribution and collaboration over security only requirements. Now this is very interesting, which means that when when your organization or when your security teams becomes part of the DevOps process as a DevSecOps team, you need to make sure that all the requirements are, in most cases, the requirements will be discussed in the team, whether it is performance requirements, whether it is your say, normal functional requirements or any other non-functional requirement. So you do the same thing with security requirements as well. You want to make sure that security requirements are also communicated in the same manner to everyone in the team, and they give their feedback to us about what they think about it, whether it is implementable or not, and things like that. Now, when you do this collaboration, what happens is it improves the education, security education in the team as well. So it achieves two key objectives for us. One is that we are able to collaborate with team members in an efficient manner, as well as we are able to drive our requirements in the team, and over a period of long time, which is longer term objectives, we also improve the education inside the organization. So then the next principle, let's move on to the next principle, which is we need to build consumable security services with APIs over mandated security controls and paperwork. Now, what does it mean, right? So this is very interesting because generally when you talk about application security teams, they are only doing sort of scans and giving results to someone else to fix something, and then they are explaining, okay, this is how you fix it in most cases. I don't say that most of the security application security engineers do that, but a lot of them. This allows us to also becoming engineers in the real sense, which means that let's say if you think that input validation should be implemented in certain manner, right? And that is your requirement. So rather than just being the arbiter of whether a certain type of input validation control is correct or wrong, you should come up with your own API, which is built in an API environment, which can be leveraged by any of the other applications your teams are building. And with this, first of all, you build it like you want to be. So you define the specification, you control what type of how well built that API is, and anyone in the organization is free to use it. So with that, it becomes consumable, and it allows you to have full control on the type of security that you want to implement. So I just talked about input validation control, but it can be, let's say we can talk about issuing internal PKI certificates for service to service communication. So you can build a PKI on your own, and you can define what type of standards are there, and you can allow them to issue a new certificate. You can define the standards on when to rotate key and things like that. So these consumable security services with APIs are really good. And what I suggest, especially in this environment, is that Netflix application security team has done a commendable job on building some of the tools which can be leveraged by a lot of you. So I would suggest that you go and check them out as well whenever you have a chance. Then the next one is business-driven security scores over rubber stamp security. So this is an extension of second principle, which is data and security science. So when we were talking about data and security science, I touched upon security scorecards a little bit. But what do we mean by business-driven security scorecards, right? Because let's say you find a vulnerability, which is SQL injection. How can you will always have this thoughts in your mind. How can you ever relate that technical vulnerability to a business objective or any issues which can happen to business, right? So that translation is very important because you want to make sure that any business is running to make profits, right? So all your technical work that you are doing, whether to find vulnerabilities or anything, is actually to protect business and to make sure that it continues to make profit and it achieves its objectives over the longer period of time. So this link of technical issues to business is something which your leaders in security needs to work on a lot on. But the idea is that there are multiple ways to go about it. Let's say you can define certain threats which are which can be which exist against your uh, business. Let's say it can be denial of service, right? So you know that if you have a denial of service attack, it can lead to disruption of business, and it can lead to a serious impact on your business, right? So depending on that, you can, let's say I was talking about SQL injection vulnerability. So SQL injection vulnerability can also be used to perform complete deletion of data, right? Which is a way of denial of service. So you can relate that denial of service using SQL injection directly to the business objective of running the business smoothly, right? So this way you have to make sure that your security scores or whatever you are measuring is directly related to business, so that when you're speaking with someone which is as part of the business, your peers, your other department heads, they'll understand the severity of a situation, and they will give appropriate attention to that. Then we go on and touch upon actually next three principles are generally not talked about in DevSecOps, because people think that DevSecOps is about integrating security into CI/CD pipeline, and once it's done, you are over, right? So you have done, you achieved your objective, the security is part of your CI/CD pipeline, and you are done with it, right? But the key part, if you understand a little more, it will be that you may have to go a little bit more in depth, right? So if you see the DevOps itself, it brings together development, QA, and operations team into the mix, right? So one of the key question that if I could ask all of you would be that which is the operations team in your security teams, right? And that's going to be security operations team, which is SOC team, right? So when you talk about SOC teams, they generally do the monitoring of the production environment, and they are responsible for any issue. They are responsible for incident management. They are responsible for tackling any issues happening in production. So the idea here is that when you have the DevSecOps principles implemented in an appropriate manner, the DevSecOps will also improve your security operations as an outcome of good implementation. And how it does it are going to be discussed with next three principles. So the first one is red and blue team exploit testing over relying on scans and theoretical vulnerabilities, right? So I think most of you would have already heard this term. It's quite famous now, red teaming, blue teaming, and things like that. But the idea here is that you have to become change from the mindset of defenders to actually see, if you find a vulnerability, what is the maximum damage it can cause to an organization. And if you try to do every time you find a new vulnerability, you will know what is the difference between a first SQL injection and what is the difference between another SQL injection. Both are same vulnerabilities, but they can still have different impact on an environment, right? And that is where the red teaming and blue team exploit testing and things like that come into picture, where if you keep on going in depth and try to exploit vulnerabilities, it will give you a greater understanding of your own environment, and it will ensure that when you build these security scorecards, when you build these vulnerabilities and discuss with other stakeholders, you yourself know which vulnerability has priority over the other, and what are the key reasons why it can be exploited, what it can do, and things like that. So it improves a lot the skills that your DevSecOps teams have, especially the security engineers working as part of those teams have. Then the second one is 24/7 proactive security monitoring. So this is straightforward. This comes as part of SOC as well, but why does it fall here along with shared threat intelligence, right? So one of the hypothesis that I have on it, and I'll try to explain it to you to make sure that you guys understand. Let's say you are working in a security operations environment, right? So there are two things that you are dealing with. One is the external attacker are trying to attack you all the time. So you have different types of sensors deployed. You might have your IDS devices, you have IPS devices, you might have web application firewalls, your firewalls, and other systems in place, including SIEM system, which is collecting logs, your MDR systems, your XDR systems, your EDR systems, right? So you're basically looking at everything and making sure that you are reacting to those things, whichever is happening from outside, or an insider threat trying to exploit one of those issues, vulnerabilities as well in your environment, right? But there is also additional changes happening in your environment, which are actually being introduced by developing new systems. So those are being introduced by your application dev teams, and your DevSecOps teams play an important role in it, right? So let's say if they are working on something and they find out that it contains a vulnerability, which is cross-site scripting, right? and then they want to go to production because business or business stakeholders or the department who is responsible for it has accepted the risk for that vulnerability, right? So if you are appropriately passing on that inside threat intelligence, this is what I call it, which is inside threat intelligence from the team's internal to the SOC team that is operating in the production environment, that look, this is an application coming into your production environment and you have to be prepared to deal with an issue which is going to be there. And web application firewall is already configured to take care of that issue. But even in that case, sometimes the web application firewalls can be bypassed using some sort of encoding methods and things like that, right? So those issues can still be exploited, but it requires more and more efficiency in the attacker's word, right? So you will have only targeted attacks against you if you have web application firewall in place, right? But it will help your security operations team to know that this something like that is being deployed to production, and this will improve your security operations a lot. So just to conclude, please remember the threat intelligence is not only external about what type of threat actors are there, what type of attacks they are causing, what type of indicator of compromise that you have to look at. It is also about in getting to know about what type of change is being introduced from inside your organization. So this is a culmination of both external threat intel and internal threat intel, which will make your security operations team a lot more proactive to the security operations. Then the last one is compliance operations over clipboards and checklists, which is an interesting term. You can also check it out, which is about continuous compliance these days. And the idea is that rather than taking compliance as a one-time activity, where you deploy something and someone once in 3 months, 6 months, or a year, or 3 years comes and checks whether you comply with a certain thing, you have these continuous compliance checks happening against your environment, so that you never fall out of those compliant and nature of the environment. You make sure that you are always compliant to certain uh, benchmarks that are available to you, and you make sure that the security benchmarks are present. So rather than doing it once in a regular blue moon, you actually do it on a continuous basis. With that said, I'll move on to the last slide, and I've tried to touch upon the ROI piece throughout the presentation and discussions that we had today. But the last piece is about how do you ensure ROI using DevSecOps, right? So this data is actually taken from IBM cost of breach report. You can go on the IBM website, you can check it out for yourself. But if you see, these are only top 5 initial compromise methods that are used in different compromises happening across the globe. And I've only taken top 5 to actually show you the importance of doing a good job with DevSecOps. So you see the first one is phishing. And I think DevSecOps has a limited role to play in it. It's more about security operations, right? And the second one, which is business email compromise, is also similar, which is these are related to email security and how you are filtering them, how you're improving security awareness of your teams and things like that. But the next three, which is vulnerability in third-party software, stolen or compromised credentials, and the malicious insiders, are all directly related to the to your DevSecOps journey. And if you implement the principles and the processes in an appropriate manner, all these three initial compromise methods can be eliminated. And you can see how much damage they are causing across the globe for different organizations. It'll give you a really good way to go about making sure that you do a good job at implementing DevSecOps and getting return on it. So when you're talking to your stakeholders in the organization, you can take it as a reference and say, talk about if you do want to improve your return on investment and if you want to protect your organization against breaches, we need to make sure that our DevSecOps processes are implemented with the right mindset, taking care of all the principles in mind, and it is going to take care of these types of threats. So just to give you the key threats, I listed 3 of them here, but you can use them appropriately. So vulnerabilities in third-party software, stolen or compromised credentials, malicious insider are all directly related to DevSecOps implementation. With that said, I think our time for discussion is over. I'll hand it over to Ritika now. Ritika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Udit. Actually, that was a very insightful and informative session, and we have got so many uh, feedback and response also from the audience. So, before we start the Q&A, today's session is in sync with EC Council's CDE certification. EC Council CDE is Certified DevSecOps Engineering. Over 850,000 DevSecOps engineer positions are listed in LinkedIn as of last year, June. The average annual salary for a DevSecOps engineer in the US is 118,000 USD, and even any entry level position pay around 108,000 USD, and workers with over 15 years of experience make more than 136,000 USD. If you are interested to know more, kindly take part in the poll which is going to conduct now. So now we will take some questions. So our first question is, during development, a lot of security controls are relaxed. As such, the security testers are likely to pick gaps that are to be closed later in the live environment. How do we deal with this in the DevSecOps approach?
So in DevSecOps, when you automate your testing, they are targeted at different environments. So let's say when you talk about dev environment where developers are allowed to play around, right? You are when you are doing your integration of, let's say, your DAS scan, it's going to be aiming at staging environment where the controls are not supposed to be relaxed. It is supposed to mirror your production environment. So yeah, the intention of this is to make sure that you are actually testing how it will work in production rather than testing it how it can be in dev environment. So making sure that your different types of security activities are targeted at an appropriate environment which is going to mirror production. It will ensure that security is conducted in an efficient manner without getting a excuse that this is a dev environment and we are going to fix it in staging. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Udit. Our next question is, what is pre-development and post-development as related to DevSecOps?
Pre-development, different ideas about it, but depending on the organization, it differs. So let's say if someone who's following agile, pre-development might be sprint zero, where you are actually discussing about the requirements, and the role that security teams should play is to perform design level activities, which is, let's say, threat modeling or discussing the security environment, security requirements with other stakeholders of the team to make sure that those are considered as part of the overall project development. So the idea is that we have activities which are pre-development and we should be doing it. How it's conducted depends on different organizations and the DevOps methodologies that they are following.
Thank you for the answer. Our next question is, how does DevSecOps increase system security? Propose some guidelines.
Sorry, I didn't understand. Can you come again?
Yeah. So how does DevSecOps increase system security? Can you please propose some guidelines?
Okay. So the idea in DevSecOps as a whole, this is a pretty elementary question. So I like to elaborate a little so that you may understand it, which is that DevSecOps intention is to automate as much as possible, right? So when you talk about system, I don't know what you meant by that term. There are different aspects of an application, right? So you have the underlying infrastructure, which can be your network where you are deploying. So it can be your cloud, on premises, and then on top of it, you have operating system. And then on top of the operating system is where your application is running. So when we talk about DevSecOps, it takes care of all three layers in the stack, and it covers the security for everything. So application may be security ASAST scan, DAS scan, your environment and network will be where you do the deployment checks. So you will do the vulnerability scans on the environment, you do the hardening of that environment as well to reduce the attack surface. That's my answer, Ritika. Over to you.
Thank you, Udit. Somebody actually asked, please elaborate on internal threats.
Internal threats, generally the term used for that is insider threat. And internal threats can be very confusing. Insider threat is easy to explain, which is primarily the threats which originate from inside the organization, right? So for example, an employee or a developer actually leaking a key for your AWS environment somewhere, or uploading the key in your Git source repository, and via that someone is stealing it from there. So insider threats origin is actually one of the trusted person inside the organization. And insider threat is the right term for that. You don't call it internal threats, you call it insider threat. And the way to deal with it is very complex. You will have to make sure that obviously you want to trust your employees, right? But olden days used to be about trust but verify, right? So every time you are trusting someone, you want to verify what actions they are taking. But nowadays the environment has shifted from that to zero trust. So you no longer trust on any administrator, be it your own organization member. So that's why you'll see principles like just-in-time access, privilege access management, zero trust principles implementation in the environment. This is all aimed at making sure that you don't have unnecessary trust on anyone, even inside the organization, and take look at everything with a risk-based approach. So if you think that there is an action which has a lot of risk, you are always reviewing it.
Thank you for the answer, Udit. We will take more two questions. So our second last question is how DevSecOps will be a good ROI.
So if you think about cybersecurity, the multiple ways to invest in it, right? So there are three key areas that cybersecurity should aim at, right? So you have to build, first of all, a framework or an architecture of security for your organization, which can be based on different things. You can follow any external framework which you prefer, or if you have an imposition based on regulatory requirements, let's say GDPR in Europe, your HIPAA if you are working for a healthcare organization in US, PCI DSS if you are processing payments. So all those frameworks are really good framework to actually build the security architecture for the organization. Then the second piece is about making sure whatever teams are building for features, products, software products for your organization's customers or internal employees, those are built in an efficient and secure manner. Or even if you're buying something from outside, let's say you are using SAP for something and you are building something on top of it. Uh, that piece is another piece where you are, if you're building something, you want to secure that. And then the last is ops, right? Which is operations. So DevSecOps actually is aimed at the last two pieces, which is to make sure that you build whatever you build is secure by design, your security is shifted left, all of the security concerns are taken care of in an application, and then it also provides impetus to your security operations. So it improves ROI by making sure that when you follow these principles, it ensures that you are protecting the threats properly, starting from building the software to the operations and over
Thank
to
you,
you,
Udit.
Ritika.
Our last, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Our last question is what is DevOps and how does it apply to security?
I think I've already covered it as part of first slide, so I'm not going to go
Yeah,
over it
actually,
again.
the person who actually posted this, he was unable to connect due to the internet issue. So
Yes. So
maybe
we can
because
go
of
back
that.
to the recording if you guys are going to share that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your all the answers. and actually it is a very good presentation. We have got so many good feedbacks. It was a pleasure to have you with us, um, and we are looking forward for more session actually. Before we conclude the webinar, would you like to give any message to our audience?
Just one, which is that in cybersecurity, you explore as much as you can, be a good hacker. That's all.
Thank you so much, Udit. Thank you to all our attendees. Before we end the session, I would like to announce our next Cyber Talk session, which is Cybersecurity Compliance Trends 2022 and 2023 by Arthur Salmon on 24th of February. To register for this session, please go to our website, which is www.eccu.edu/cyber talks. The link is given in the chat section. Hope to see you all on 24th of Feb. On behalf of the entire Cyber Talks and our presenter, thank you once again for joining us today and have a great rest of your day. You all may disconnect your line. Thank you.